Okay, comparing poems. How do you do it? It's one of the most difficult things to do, but it can be done if you take a bit of time and thought over it. Right, first rule is, if you want to get good at comparing poems, is you have to read and reread them and think about them. Okay, so it's not a sort of simple mathematical formula. There are some tips and tricks I can give you, but nothing replaces you reading them, rereading them, thinking about them. I've been reading these poems for years now, and I still see new things in them, and I could still approach my comparisons in different ways. Now, you've been told to compare the two poems, The Letter and Conscious, to explore the ways in which the poet represents the impact of war. So you'll need to read the poems and go through them and underline the actual lines that show the impact of war, and then take a step back and think about the poems and think about what are they actually saying that's similar about the impact of war. They've given you some guidelines in the exam to talk about the situations the soldiers are in, the feelings they're in, and the language and the effects of the language. So my recommendation is, do follow those guidelines. They're loose guidelines. You don't have to, of course. It's not strictly necessary, but it's quite useful. Right, so what you'll have to do is put your thinking cap on. Firstly, let's think about the situations that the men are in and the kind of impact of war upon the situations they're in. Well, obviously, the situations they're in are entirely because they are at war. We've got the letter where we've got men in a trench being bombed, and the person saying the poem is actually injured or possibly killed. It's entirely because he's at war. But then let's think about it in a bit more depth. Obviously the best answers will do this. Censorship. Now that is partly because they're at war, but it's also partly because of the type of society he is in. This is a society, British society at the time of the First World War, which tried to promote war as being heroic and a good thing, and they would not allow anyone to represent war in a different way, and so letters home were censored. So that's partly because of the actual situation in the country and the impact of war. Well, war has brought out, hasn't it, this situation. It's highlighted this situation, that this is a society that doesn't really want to know the truth. It's a society that peddles the lie, isn't it? Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori, the lie that it's sweet and beautiful to die for your country. Right, conscious, the situation. Well, if you to compare it, well, it's a very different situation because he's in hospital, isn't he? He's not in a trench, and he's clearly traumatised, injured, and shell-shocked from what has happened to him. You could say that conscious is sort of the sequel to the letter, couldn't you? That conscious reveals what might have happened to the person who wrote the letter after he was taken to hospital, if he lived. And in the second verse of Conscious, we see how his situation of seeing crimson slaughter was, you know, very similar to what happened in the letter, where we see slaughter, don't we, at the end. You know, he's very badly injured. Right, feelings. Now, you could go through these poems and really go into depth about the similarities and differences between the feelings of the expressed in the poems. Okay, the letter is quite complex, isn't it? Because we have the feelings that he's trying to show to his family, which are clearly he's representing his feelings in a way which is not truthful. He's saying, you know, I'm in the pink, I'm healthy, and he's not, and he's trying to say that he's happy, but he's not. and then we have the feelings that he shows to the soldiers, feelings of panic, worry, anxiety, and complete shock at the end. So again, try and find lines which show those sort of feelings and explore them for yourself. And then you can also talk about the feelings the poem is provoking in you, what it makes you think. The feelings in conscious, well, again, they're complex, aren't they? Because we see how he wakes up and he's trying to make an effort to wake up, and there's certain elements of things that he likes, the mayflowers, but then panic grips him. He wants a drink of water, and by the end of the poem he's forgotten that he even wants that, and he's just engulfed in confusion because of the flashbacks that he's having in his mind. Again, both poems share and have a similarity in the sense that they are revealing feelings of panic and anxiety, but they're doing that in different ways. So a good answer will explore the different ways they're showing it. You know, one, the conscious, we're inside a man's head, aren't we? We're actually seeing what he sees in his brain. He's seeing the crimson slaughter in his brain, whereas in the letter, we're hearing what he says to people. We don't go inside his brain as such, we can only guess what's going on inside his mind. So that's a quite important thing to remember. Right, language and its effects. Well, you could go on for a long time exploring the similarities and differences in the use of language, but you know, you need to look carefully. A few thoughts. Right, both poems use language, don't they, to show the horror of war. Okay, both poems reveal the destruction of war, and so you look for the language that expresses that destruction, that sense of things going very wrong. But both poems, they're very different in tone and approach, aren't they? The letter is written in the language of a soldier, isn't it? The language he uses in the letter and the language he uses when he's shouting to his friends or colleagues in the trench, his comrades in the trench. Conscious is a much more consciously poetic poem, isn't it? And he's using language to, in a lyrical way. It's quite evocative, the language. It's trying to evoke the place, isn't it? It's trying to evoke visual images with the mayflowers and the crimson slaughter. So conscious is kind of quite different in many ways in its use of language. Look also at the kind of classic techniques that he uses, you know, rhyme and rhythm. They are poems, aren't they? So look at the ways in which he uses rhyme to emphasize certain key points or images, and look at the ways in which the rhythm of the language works. You know, sometimes there's kind of flowing sentences, aren't there, that deliberately kind of evoke an atmosphere of calm, and then other times we have these very short, choppy sentences to create a sense of panic. Look also at the imagery of the poems. Remember, imagery can be visual imagery, imagery that creates pictures in your head, and Owen is amazing at that, isn't it? And then there's imagery that creates sort of sounds in your head. Owen's great at that. He uses onomatopoeia, alliteration, assonance at various points. And then also look at the metaphors and similes. That's also imagery, the comparative imagery, imagery where he's making comparisons between things. Okay? You need to discuss the effects of a language. So that is, they're really asking for a personal response. They're asking you to think about what the language makes you see in your head, you know, and explain why you see those sorts of things, what your language makes you feel. the emotions you feel when you read the poems, and what it makes you think, the sort of thought processes. Now, when you're doing this, refer to other readings of the poem you've looked at. You can listen to my reading of the poem on SoundCloud, where I've put music and sound effects. You can discuss the ways in which I've done it if you want to. Kenneth Branagh reads these poems really interestingly and very well, in a very different way from me, obviously. And then, you yourselves in class, I've asked my pupils to sort of act out the poems. You could talk about, what you felt when you saw the poems sort of acted out. They're very dramatic, aren't they? They're almost like mini plays or little film scripts, which kind of reveal a sort of fragment of a soldier's life. And you could talk about the ways in which the language does create dramatic effects in a way in which perhaps a playwright might do, like Shakespeare, or a film writer. They have that quality to them. So talk about language in the broader sense as well, not just sort of focusing on alliteration and onomatopoeia and rhyme and rhythm, but think about the kind of bigger picture, the sorts of things that language really makes you insist that the poem creates a sort of mini play in your head.